This is Lisa Schwartz at Berkeley Lab. Welcome to the webinar for our new report on the cost of saving electricity. Today, co-principal investigator Chuck Goldman and report lead author Ian Hoffman will present key findings. I also want to recognize our other co-authors, Sean Murphy, Natalie Mims-Frick, and Greg Levenis, and we gratefully acknowledge our funders at the U.S. Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency. The presentation today will cover why this research matters, our data, approach, and definition of terms, the cost of saving electricity for utilities and other program administrators at the national, regional, and market sector levels, and for select program types. Our first ever efficiency cost curve, the total cost of saving electricity, including cost to program participants, and we'll discuss our results and future research. Following the presentation, I'll moderate discussion of questions from the audience. First, here are a few housekeeping items. We're recording the webinar, and we'll post it on our website. And because of the large number of participants, everyone is in listen mode only. So please use the chat box to send us your questions and comments. Please enter your questions at any time. We'll answer as many as we can following the presentation, and I'll moderate questions and answers with the authors. The report and webinar slides and a more extensive summary slide deck are posted at the website shown here, and following the webinar, we'll post a recording. So why do we care about the cost of saving electricity? First, efficiency helps ensure reliability of the electricity system at the most affordable cost. And many states recognize the role of efficiency, both as an energy resource and as a capacity resource. Also, spending on programs funded by utility customers is significant. It grew about 20% from 2011 to 2016. And declining costs for natural gas, wind, and solar resources underscores the importance of understanding the cost of saving a kilowatt hour now and projecting into the future. Second, we can use this information to help project efficiency's impact on future electricity loads. Third, we can benchmark efficiency program results with regional and national estimates. And the data also are valuable for initial screening of efficiency resource alternatives and for evaluating how program costs are likely to change over time with funding levels and participation. Ian?
Thanks, Lisa. So we launched the Cost of Saved Energy project about 6 years ago to address those needs that Lisa just enumerated, to help policymakers and utilities weigh different resource options, to assess program approaches and performance, and encourage more consistent and rigorous reporting. And so we go into utility regulatory dockets all over the country. We collect data on programs that are funded by investor-owned utility customers. The lab's DSM program database now tracks more than 1,700 unique electric energy efficiency programs offered by 116 program administrators. And with that data across multiple years, we've now analyzed nearly 9,000 program years of efficiency data from 41 states. That's everything that's in orange and blue in that map over at the lower right. And we collect savings and spending data information where it's available on program average measured lifetimes, the number of participants, more than that. And we also collect the cost to the participants, so what they are paying for more efficient goods and services. We have that data in the 27 states there in blue. And we standardize all this data in order to aggregate it, to analyze it in a self-consistent way, and we characterize programs according to a topology of dozens of distinct program types. We'll talk about that in a moment, and also according to a consistent set of terms, a kind of data dictionary that was originally developed by the State and Local Energy Efficiency Action Initiative. We've also created spreadsheet tools for both private and public program administrators in order to strengthen reporting. So here's an illustration of our program topology. We developed this topology based on the diversity of programs that we found out there. We classify every single program according to more than 60 different detailed program categories that in turn are consolidated into nearly 30 simplified program categories or program families, you can think of them as. These are then further consolidated into 6 sectors. We're not showing all of the programs here because of space limitations, but the multi-layered approach here allows us to define them by the market sector, the technology, their design and delivery approach. So why have so many? And when we're trying to calculate the cost of saved electricity, we really need the economic lifetime for the savings. And the more narrowly and cleanly we can define the programs, the better we can define those economic lifetimes. You can see here there's refrigerator recycling, data centers, lots of pumps, industrial irrigation, your backyard pool. Our topology means we have values for each one of these. All told, we have about $25 billion in spending on electric energy efficiency programs in the database through 2015. About a third of that, $8.3 billion, was spent on residential programs, lighting programs, whole home upgrades, and rebates for prescriptive measures such as HVAC replacements. These account for about 2/3 of residential program spending and about 3/4 of lifetime savings. Lighting programs are a fifth of spending, but the largest source of those residential savings, about 45%. The more common pattern in the residential sector, though, is for program spending to be somewhat of a larger share of the sector total, but savings to be somewhat of a smaller share. In the C&I sector, there's some differences from what we observe in the residential sector. First, there's just more. The C&I sector accounts for more than half of the spending in our database, nearly twice the savings. And most of that spending and savings comes from a few program types: custom retrofits, prescriptive rebates, small commercial programs. These are 3/4 of the spending and savings in the C&I sector. And you can see that the relative shares, relative program shares of sector spending and savings are really closer to the same percentages. So briefly, I just want to talk about how we define the cost of saved electricity. The program administrator cost of saved electricity is the cost to the program of acquiring the savings, spread out evenly or levelized over the economic lifetime of those savings, and then discounted back to the year in which the costs are paid and the actions occur. And the cost here are our program spending on planning, administering, designing, and implementing programs, providing incentives to market allies and program participants to take actions that result in energy savings, as well as the cost of verifying those savings. In essence, the cost of saved electricity equations are treating energy efficiency as an investment to be repaid over time. So several values are critical here. We talked about spending. Discounting, we use a 6% real rate, comparable, we think, to the utility weighted average cost of capital. And then we need how long the savings from a program measure is expected to last. We talked about that, the program average measure lifetime. And lastly, we need savings. We use gross savings because that's what most program administrators report and what matters most from a resource perspective. The total cost of saved electricity is the same equation, but it includes the cost to the program administrator and the cost to the participant. Participant cost here is the consumer's purchase cost for energy efficiency, appliances, equipment, or other measures, minus any incentives that are paid by the program, such as rebates. Those are already accounted for in the program administrator cost. With that, I'll hand it off to Chuck.
Thanks, Ian and Lisa. So I'm going to talk about the results for the program administrator cost of saved energy. This chart summarizes our national results for all electric efficiency programs in our sample between 2009 and 2015. We're calculating a cost of saved electricity for each program for the entire portfolio, sort of at a national level. On the left, about 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour, and then for each market sector as you move to the right. The numbers beneath each bar are the sample sizes. the total number of program years, that being a program operating for a year. The residential sector provided the lowest cost energy savings during this period with a heavy reliance on lighting rebate programs, as you've seen from the previous charts. You see on the right that the cost for low-income programs is about 10.5 cents a kilowatt hour. The programs for low-income households account for a modest share of overall savings, about 2%, and spending about 9%. It's important to acknowledge and recognize that there are customer participant costs are lower in these programs than other programs, and oftentimes there's repair work that must be done in many cases before efficiency measures can be installed. And finally, the low-income programs also often have aims beyond energy savings, for example, reducing the energy bills of low-income participants, or improved safety, or improving the health of occupants, or increasing their comfort. This chart shows the regional results. The savings weighted cost to save energy varies widely among census regions, ranging from a low of about 1.5 cents in the Midwest to 3.3 cents in the Northeast. The cost to save energy values are comparable in the South and the West regions. And the average program administrator value in the Midwest is about 40% lower than the national average of 2.5 cents. A few states in the Midwest region have fairly mature markets for efficient goods and services, Minnesota, Illinois. However, many Midwest states were ramping up their efficiency programs between 2009 and 2015, and were delivering low-cost savings, particularly with investments in industrial and agricultural efficiency and residential lighting. In this chart, we show an aggregate cost to save energy results for programs offered by administrators in each state. As you can see, 16 states have cost to save energy values that are less than or equal to 2 cents a kilowatt hour during this period. These states tend to be concentrated in the Midwest, South, and Intermountain West. In some cases, these states tend to be relatively new to efficiency at that time, or their portfolios were included a modest set of programs with a heavy focus on lighting. 5 states had cost to save energy values that exceeded 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and 4 of those states were located in the Northeast. Those states tend to have relatively high electricity prices, extensive histories in pursuing energy savings, and strong policy commitments, such as statutory mandates to acquire all cost-effective efficiency or meet specified savings targets. Thus, they tend to have greater market saturation for efficiency measures and have mined more of the lowest cost savings opportunities. In this chart, we show cost to save energy values for 2015 by state compared to savings as a percent of retail sales in that state. The chart provides one way to assess the relative impact of higher savings targets on the cost to save energy of program administrators in each state. So between 2009 and 15, we see that 9 of the states reported savings that exceeded 1.5% of sales, 4 states reported savings that exceeded 2%, and 23 states reported savings equal to about 1% or more. We see that the program administrator cost to save energy tends to be higher in states that have achieved more aggressive savings levels. We could also observe that there's a fair amount of spread in the values. Cost to save energy values vary by a factor of 3 in states that are reporting comparable level of savings as a percent of retail sales. So other factors are clearly at play here. In this chart, we show cost to save energy results for different types of residential programs. The average cost of efficiency varies widely among residential programs. This range in cost performance is largely a reflection of differences in program delivery and measure mix. So, for example, the lighting rebate programs are about 1.1 cents a kilowatt hour, and as Ian said, they account for 45% of the lifetime savings in the residential sector. The cost to save energy is about 2.9 cents for appliance and consumer electronics and appliance recycling programs, and they account for about 10% of the sector savings. And these programs often, because they're low cost, they often allow program administrators to offer other higher cost but more comprehensive programs as part of their residential efficiency portfolio. And they're an essential element of compliance strategies to meet savings targets. Whole home retrofit programs typically have a higher cost of savings, in our sample about 6.9 cents, because projects are more comprehensive in scope. They often include HVAC system replacements, and cold climates, air sleeve and insulation are often common measures. The average cost to save energy for behavior feedback programs in our sample is about 6.5 cents a kilowatt hour. Why? The largest programs in our sample, in terms of customers and savings, were expanding their programs to more residential customers, becoming system-wide programs. They were often located in milder climates, and they were located in territories where efficiency programs have been operating for many years. These programs tend to have a strong influence on the savings weighted average that we're showing you here. But also importantly, nearly all program administrators that reported savings were using measure lifetimes of only 1 year during the time period of our study. And more recent evaluations suggest that some of these behavioral feedback programs, the savings can last 2 or 3 years. If the savings do last for 3 years, then the savings weighted average cost to save energy for these programs would be about 2.8 cents rather than over 6. This next chart shows the range in cost to save energy values. We're showing median values, savings weighted averages, and interquartile ranges. That's the 25th and 75th percentile values for all the programs if you order them from lowest to highest cost, the same type of program. You can see that the median value in the sector is 4 cents kilowatt hour, somewhat higher than the savings weighted average. And clearly there's a lot of variability. So you can see, for example, that whole home retrofit, new construction, and HVAC programs all require more capacity building for program administrators to implement and scale up. Thus, these programs tend to have higher first-year costs, which often decreases the number of projects or homes increase with time. So the variability in some other program types can also be attributed in part to different program designs and measure mixes within a program. So, for example, we have multifamily programs, some that focus on replacing old HVAC equipment versus those that focus on replacing lighting in common areas and units. So shifting to the C&I sector, in this chart we show those results for different types of C&I programs. You can see that the average cost of energy is about 2.5 cents. The profile here for the C&I sector is different than the residential sector. The 3 types of C&I programs, rebates for custom retrofits, prescriptive rebates, and new construction, account for about 75% of the sector's annual and lifetime savings. And the average values for these 3 programs range between 1.9 and 2.6 cents. Custom rebate programs tend to be the largest program in a utility's C&I portfolio, accounting for about 37% of lifetime savings across our sample. Thus, unlike the residential sector, where you have a larger share, we have a larger share of programs with low to moderate cost savings in the C&I sector, and that the programs that are lower cost oftentimes can be quite comprehensive and multi-measure, as oftentimes happens for the custom programs. Programs that target small C&I customers also contribute about 10% of the sector savings, with an average cost to save energy of about 3.8 cents. So you can see that some program administrators offer distinct programs for small C&I customers. Sometimes the eligibility requirements related to maximum customer size, different program designs that may include higher rebate levels, or rely on direct install for contractors. That's part of the reason that the costs to save energy tend to be higher in this market segment. We also examined trends in the cost to save electricity between 2010 and 15. In our sample of 116 administrators, we had program data for 51 of them for the entire study period. So we focused on that group because we have 6 years of data for each utility. And what you can see from this table is that the savings-weighted values increased by about 3.5% for all 51 of these program administrators. But it's interesting to look at some of the trends within that. So what we did is we segmented these administrators by size into 3 equal groups of 17 administrators based on their annual energy savings. And the annual savings tends to be correlated with the size of the utility. So the highest third group of the administrators, they account for about 2/3 of the savings total. And that tends to drive the overall results of what we're seeing. But in contrast, for the lower third, which tend to be some of the smaller utilities, oftentimes newer programs, they only account for about 7% of the savings. You can see that their cost to save energy starts out a little bit higher, and it declines over time as they sort of ramp up. In this next chart, we show the aggregate program cost curve at a national level. for electricity efficiency programs during this entire period based on program administrators' reporting. This chart provides insight into the relative contribution of each program type to the efficiency resource at a national level. The y-axis shows the cost of saved energy in dollars per kilowatt hour. Programs are arrayed along the x-axis in ascending order based on their relative cost of saved energy. The width of each bar on the x-axis is scaled to represent the lifetime savings for that type of program. And the values at the top of the bar, which are probably pretty hard to see in this chart anyway, show the percentage of total lifetime savings for all programs in our sample. So what you can see is that programs aimed at supporting more aggressive building codes are the least cost efficiency resource, but these programs are really only offered in several states like California and Massachusetts. Residential lighting and consumer product rebate programs provide the most lifetime savings overall, 19% of total savings nationally at the lowest cost, followed by C&I custom and prescriptive rebate programs, and we've disaggregated them further by market sector. So we have examples of industrial and agricultural programs, or programs that target all three sectors, commercial, industrial, and ag, we call them mixed, and so on. So in some sense, in future, well, this chart also highlights the fact of the programs in blue, which are residential programs, this dichotomy between the lower cost programs on the left and some of the higher cost programs on the right, which tend to be more comprehensive multi-measure programs targeted at home energy savings. In the future, we may extend this approach to do this kind of analysis at the regional level, but this provides sort of a national picture. Lisa?
Thanks, Chuck. So I just want to remind everyone, you can send us your questions and comments anytime. Please use the chat box, and we will cover your questions as we have time following the webinar. Ian?
Thanks, Lisa. So the total cost of saved electricity, again, is that full all-in cost of savings, including what participants are contributing. For all programs, 2009 through 2015, that total cost is 5 cents per kilowatt hour. For programs that are targeting residential customers, it's 3.9 cents. For C&I customers, it's 5.5 cents per kilowatt hour. For programs that are focused on low-income customers, it's 14.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And in general, we can look at this as marshaling investment in a resource. Here, the program administrator spending is leveraging investment by the participants. In essence, they're buying the resource together. And for the full portfolio of programs nationally, the program administrator share is about 54% of total cost, while participants are contributing about 46%. Up at the state level, the total cost of saved electricity vary by more than a factor of 3, similar to what we see with the program administrator cost of saved electricity, ranged from a low of 2.6 cents per kilowatt hour to more than 8 cents per kilowatt hour. 9 of the 27 states for which we have total cost data acquired savings for less than 4 cents per kilowatt hour. These states were found in multiple parts of the country. 3 of them in the West, 3 are in the Midwest, 2 are in the South, 1 is in the Northeast. In all 15 of 27 states, we're below the national average of 5 cents per kilowatt hour. Among the states with higher total cost of saved energy values, those that are greater than 6 cents per kilowatt hour, most of them are in the Northeast and West. And as Chuck indicated with a similar chart over on the program administrator cost side, these are states with long histories in energy efficiency. They have higher avoided cost. They're mature markets. You can also see that the relative share of program administrator costs and participant costs here differs from region to region. For example, program administrators tend to pay more of the total cost in the South, dramatically less in the Midwest, for example. Turning to the residential sector, I noted a moment ago that the sector average is 3.9 cents per kilowatt hour. Lighting programs at 2.7 cents per kilowatt hour are driving those sector results, since they account for almost half of the sector savings. This is important especially from a cost effectiveness standpoint, because the low cost savings from lighting are helping to kind of undergird the economics for the rest of the sector and enable the offering of some of these other programs. Indeed, that full portfolio that Chuck discussed with the cost curve. Nearly all of the other residential programs have rather higher average values for the total cost of saved energy, ranging from 7.4 cents per kilowatt hour for multifamily programs to 13.6 per kilowatt hour for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning programs. Behavioral programs are kind of in the middle of the pack at around 8 cents per kilowatt hour. But again, Chuck went over some of the reasons for that kind of value, again, that value would be rather dramatically lower if the savings were credited for more than a year. Across the residential sector, program administrators are generally paying on average, are paying 57% of the cost of saved electricity, total cost of saved electricity, compared to 43% from program participants. But that ratio differs significantly when you get down to the program level. Participants tended to pay more of the cost of saved energy in lighting programs, about 55% on average. It's an even split for HVAC programs, but program administrators pay more of the total cost in many other major program types. It's 61% for appliance and consumer electronic rebate programs. It's 67% for whole home retrofits, 83% for multifamily programs. Behavioral programs, by and large, most of these are these home energy report programs, are paying all of the cost. Looking at the C&I sector, the average total cost of saved energy, electricity for the sector is 5.5 cents per kilowatt hour. It's about 40% higher than in the residential sector. More than 3/4 of the sector savings are concentrated in three program types, in custom retrofits and prescriptive rebates and new construction programs. And the cost of that savings varies much less than we see in the residential sector. The difference in the total cost of saved electricity among these larger saving programs all fall within about a cent and a half of one another. There is nonetheless some variability up at the higher end with smaller saving programs, about going up to 9.1 cents per kilowatt hour for programs that are targeting local and state government buildings, universities, schools, and hospitals. Broadly speaking, at the sector level, and then for most of the common program types, participants here are paying a slightly larger share of the total cost than the program administrator. So we see somewhat of a higher degree of leverage than in the residential sector. Lisa?
Okay, I'm going to talk about discussion and future research directions. This next slide summarizes in the first three bullets our key findings. In the interest of time and the fact that we've covered them, I'm not going to talk much more about them. I urge you to look at the report. I do want to spend more time talking a little bit about the potential implications of our findings and our work. So for the first time, we developed this national cost curve that provides a composite picture of the efficiency resource across market sectors and program types. The low-cost savings from rebates on residential consumer products, especially lighting, tend to have the effect of reducing the cost estimates for the portfolio as a whole. And they account for about 20% of the lifetime savings of the entire portfolio. However, going forward, the combined effect of lighting standards and trends within the lighting market, specifically with LEDs in terms of declining costs and increasing market penetration, are clearly going to have an effect on the composition of future programs. So a new phase of federal lighting standards takes effect in 2020. When residential service lamps, other than linear fluorescence, will have to deliver 45 lumens per watt. These lighting standards are likely to change the baseline against which savings are calculated. So, for example, the savings differential between CFLs compared to incandescents is greater than between LEDs and CFLs. So the magnitude of prospective savings may decline for lighting programs which seek to promote next-generation technologies or serve hard-to-reach markets, particularly in the residential market. In the C&I market, nearly 50% of the lifetime savings come from rebates for C&I custom retrofits, prescriptive measures, and new construction. These programs have cost-saved energy values that are attractive, 2 to 3 cents a kilowatt-hour. The bulk of these savings come from large customers. In recent years, more states have allowed C&I customers to opt out of efficiency programs or choose self-direct program options. This phenomenon often leads to situations where 10 to 30% of a utility's load, particularly in the Midwest, is no longer eligible to participate in efficiency programs offered by the administrator. If this trend continues or expands in more states, it's likely to shift reliance for savings in the C&I sector onto market sectors that are dominated by smaller or mid-sized customers. And in many cases, those programs tend to have somewhat higher cost of saved energy values. So, in the aggregate sense, a shrinking C&I market for program administrators may put upward pressure on cost of saved energy values in the C&I sector. Turning to sort of progress and challenges, in the 6 or 7 years that we've been doing this project, we've seen a lot of progress. For example, we've added 10 states into our initial sample compared to previous work. We've got total cost of saved energy data for 27 states, and that's 7 more than we've had previously. And we see generally this notion of program-level reporting, not just reporting at a portfolio or market section level, seems to be spreading, and that allows it gives you more granularity and allows you to look at the quality of reporting more specifically. So, for example, we also see that 54% of the administrators are now reporting participant costs, and that allows us to calculate the total cost of saved energy, and that's important from a societal perspective to look at both what it costs administrators and what it costs society to run these kind of programs. But it's also important to note that there are still significant challenges. The annual reports from many program administrators still do not provide a complete picture of the impacts or costs of efficiency investment at the program level. The reports may meet state regulatory requirements, but there's still room for improvement in the consistency, completeness, and transparency of program-level reporting. So to give a couple examples, program average measure lifetimes are essential for calculating the cost of saved energy and for estimating lifetime savings from first-year savings. Yet only about 30% of our administrators report measure lifetime, lifetime savings, or both. So these administrators tend to manage larger portfolios, so the programs represent about 40% of the programs in our database. But what this means in practice is that we impute program average measure lifetime for over half of the program years based on the average values from the programs where we have this data. Moreover, for similar types of programs, we discovered that program average lifetimes vary significantly. It's typical to see that program average lifetimes vary by 5 years among the middle 50% of programs for a certain program type. And at the extremes, between the lowest and the highest programs, you can see a 10 to 15 year spread in some cases. And this can be explained oftentimes by the variability in program design or measure mix. But the variability in measure lifetimes, it's a critical issue going forward because it allows you to benchmark results against national practices. And all else being equal, program administrators that report longer measure lifetimes for their measures will have lower cost of saved energy values compared to those that report shorter lifetimes. So the differences in assumed program lifetimes can have a significant impact on the cost of saved energy values. So we think that additional efforts are warranted to improve the consistency by which we report lifetimes of installed measures for program administrators located in similar climate regions, possibly including proposing default values and guidelines for treating and accounting for market activities such as renovation and remodeling, which are oftentimes accounted for in some parts of the country and which tend to lead toward more conservative estimates of measure lifetime, which we think are appropriate, but it takes additional work. It's also important for program administrators to report information on participant costs, contributions, in order to calculate the total values for a cost of saved energy. And so far, that really only happens in about 27 states. in terms of the annual reports. And so it's important, again, to have more transparency. It's a difficult area in terms of how you calculate and estimate incremental measure costs. And it's really, there are standard practices that are evolving, but there's more work that could be done. And then we have a couple of cases in a couple of states where utilities continue to redact program data. And so basically stakeholders really can't determine what's going on at the program level in terms of programs. But ultimately, the bottom line is that we think that full and detailed reporting of efficiency activities is important for grid operators, utilities, and public utility commissions because it will help increase the confidence in energy efficiency as a resource that can make a difference on the electricity system, and also to make better informed decisions in general about allocation of resources across different types of resources. In terms of the project specifically, this chart sort of highlights some of the research directions where we intend to go. And the next year or so, we've gotten additional funding from DOE to broaden the scope to include more emphasis on public power utilities. So building on some prior work, we hope to collect data on the cost of saving electricity for public power utilities and publish a technical brief. We've worked with APPA in the past, and we hope to work with them and other public power utilities to sort of get more information at the program level on these kind of programs. We're also going to be developing metrics to report on peak demand impacts. There's increasing interest by utilities and grid operators and policymakers in the time-varying impacts of efficiency measures and programs. So we hope to contribute to that understanding in terms of the impact of efficiency measures in reducing peak demand, building on some work that we've done this past year. We're also going to update the cost of saving natural gas. In our first report in 2013, we put out information on both electricity and gas programs based on data from 2009 to 11, pretty dated. So in 2018, we're going to undertake a limited update of the cost of saving gas, focusing on large and dual fuel programs. Finally, we will keep working on trying to standardize the way in which net savings are reported in terms of being able to be used for calculating the cost of saved energy. We hope to get more detailed data by cost category, and that should allow us to look at issues about marketing and administrative costs versus other kinds of costs as well as participant costs. So that's sort of the direction that we're going, and I look forward to the question and answer session. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Chuck and Ian. We have so many good questions. Let's get started and see how many we can answer in the remaining 22 minutes. So first, we've got a question from Ken Costello at NRRI. Are the energy savings that we're using for our report, are they based largely on engineering simulation studies? I'm gonna ask for volunteers. Chuck or Ian?
I can take that one. The savings that are reported by utilities come from a combination of sources. They typically are based on their technical reference manuals that they produce, and the values for that are based on engineering estimates, computer simulations, and they're informed by impact evaluations that are done by third-party evaluators. Practices vary among states and administrators, but in the best case, the savings values that are reported for most of the measures have been vetted through various types of evaluations. In the worst case, well, in the cases where people are just starting out, they tend to be more engineering simulations, engineering estimates.
Okay, this is an easy question to cover. Ian, what does the term participants cover when we're talking about the total cost of saved energy?
Sure. It's just the folks who are taking the rebate, who are taking advantage of a discount. They are the folks who generally are kicking in some of the upfront cost of the measures. There are exceptions. With behavioral programs, generally there are no participant costs. There are a few very rare exceptions to that, but so it depends a little bit on the program design. But in most cases, again, these are folks who are putting in some of the cost of the total cost of savings. End use customers. Yes.
Chuck, when you talk about cost, how does this value relate to the various cost tests that utilities use to evaluate programs, like ratepayer impact measures and so forth?
So this project and the things that we're reporting, which are really costs and savings, are essentially inputs to the traditional benefit cost tests that are being done by utilities and program administrators as they screen programs. But it's really important to recognize they're not the same thing. So we're not talking about the value side other than we're talking about the actual explicit savings impacts. So the results of the outputs of this work, costs and savings, are typically used in screening tests that are done around by commissions and utilities around the country. But they're not analogous. We're not calculating the total resource cost test. We're not calculating the ratepayer test or a utility cost test. But we're taking the savings and the spending values that are reported sort of to calculate levelized costs.
Ian, let's go back to participants again. How were the participant costs calculated specifically for the behavioral feedback programs that you evaluated?
Yeah, so I just mentioned there are a very, very small number of these programs that do include some participant costs. And so these are somewhat hybridized programs where the majority of the savings are coming from the home energy reports, the behavioral feedback normative messaging that the program administrator is putting out to its customers. But sometimes they're augmenting that by adding some element of online auditing or some additional step that can incur participant costs. And so we do go ahead and add those costs in for those programs.
The costs, really, for the most part, are the costs that the utility is paying the implementer, the contractor, to implement this program. So the O-Powers of the world are getting payments from utilities for running these programs. That's what you're seeing.
Or Oracle now, I guess.
Sorry.
So there's a question here about low-income programs. Is the multi-measure nature of low-income programs what is driving the relatively higher cost per kilowatt hour? And how does that differ from other non-low-income multi-measure programs? And I guess to answer that question, let's stay within the residential sector. Ian, you want to try that one?
Yeah, well, one of the big differences here is that the low-income program administrators are paying the full freight. They're paying the entire cost for the measures, for the installation, and so we don't see that over on for non-low-income programs. We will see it for certain program designs, but many other program administrators will just use the incremental costs. So it's a substantially lower cost profile, and I think Chuck covered some of the other reasons. The condition of the housing often calls for some renovation for fixing things up in order for the measures to be installed. Sometimes there's some health and safety issues that also have to be addressed, say with combustion safety.
The other thing is that some low-income programs save both natural gas and electricity, and all that we're reporting here are the electricity savings.
So here's a question, sort of drilling down a little further into related questions we've addressed. Were most of your data derived from audits done for utility programs conducted by the utilities themselves or by a third party hired by a utility? And I think this is really getting to, look, we use the reported data. What's the nature of that reported data?
So the majority of the data is actually generated by the utility as their claimed savings at the end of the program year. We do in some cases, though, have access to evaluations that are done fairly quickly after the conclusion of that program year, and we will use those values again, but just for gross. So even if the evaluation gets into net savings and so forth, all of our calculations are based upon the gross values.
All right, Chuck, here's a question for you. This is our first ever cost curve that we developed with our cost of saving electricity data. So what are some of the ways that states, utilities, and stakeholders can use that new information?
Well, the cost curve highlights the existing mix and the relative cost performance and magnitude of different programs nationally. The mix and size of various programs is likely to shift over the next decade. So the national program cost curve helps illuminate the impact on the overall program spending as the program mix changes. So for example, as I mentioned, if we have less residential lighting or we have fewer large C&I customers that may not participate in these programs, that's going to have an impact on how the portfolio changes. So you can test out different evolutionary paths for the portfolio of efficiency programs, and you can use it to benchmark the cost performance of existing programs compared to national values. With more program data and even larger sample sizes, we could create program cost curves for regions, which may prove to be useful for states in those regions and utilities that are interested in looking at cost performance or the relative mix of program portfolios in their region.
Great, thanks, Chuck. Here's another question about behavioral feedback programs. The question is, they don't appear to be as cost effective as perhaps advertised by behavioral economists. So beyond just extending the expected useful life of these programs for perhaps just 1 year, what do you see as the future for behavioral feedback programs and that might bring costs down or increase savings? Ian, do you want to take that one?
Well, sure, and some of these changes are already occurring. So some of it is optimizing the frequency of the messaging. Obviously, if you only have to send a message out quarterly, it costs you less than if you're sending it out monthly. You can indirectly defray some of these costs by maximizing the extent to which these programs serve as gateways, as referral points for other programs in your portfolio. Increasing the degree to which you're kind of sending people over for lighting or appliances or what have you. I do think there's still a fair amount of work to be done on that EUL issue on the measure life, and I think it'll be interesting to see kind of how studies turn out on this issue of persistence and how that may change over time, and whether or not we might get some changes in how people respond to messaging. Go ahead.
I want to add 2 points to this. One, we're using the most conservative assumptions about measure lifetime, 1 year. And there's pretty substantial evidence that in many of these programs, some fraction of the behavioral actions are lasting more than a year, which would lower the cost of saved energy value that we're reporting. And second, this cohort of programs has among the most rigorous M&V of any kind of program that we have in our sample. So a lot of these programs are being evaluated through randomized control trials with treatment and control groups using billing data. So that 1 or 2 or 3% savings over tens of thousands of households is pretty robust statistically. And I think it's important to note that, at least when you try to factor that in with other kinds of programs which tend to be based more on engineering analysis.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to ask another. I want to ask another question. Let's move on.
There is one more quick point, though. Is those studies to which I think you're referring, most of those were done a few years ago when many of these programs were pilots, and they were addressing chiefly the quintiles of customer classes that had the highest consumption. And now we've seen those programs become, mainstream resource programs, and they're addressing 3 or 4 quintiles of consumption, and so the amount of savings is dropping while the costs are coming up.
Okay, we are going to move on now here. So there's a question, Chuck, about how can we use this analysis for comparing bang for the buck? So relative energy efficiency programs relative to demand response programs. and also perhaps relative to incentives for rooftop solar and other distributed generation programs?
I may ask you to repeat that one in terms of bang.
Sure. I mean,
I guess
yeah,
I would.
really,
well, I guess I would say the following. One, you can see that the costs vary a lot by region and state and administrator, and I think it's important for everybody in their area to sort of have that kind of knowledge of where the resource fits. In relative terms, the cost for these programs are still pretty attractive to the program administrators at 2.5 cents. I think it's incumbent on people running these programs to do a really good job of getting high-quality data so that there's some high degree of confidence in the values that are there and that are being reported. The other thing I guess I would say is that the metrics that we're using are pretty simple. And I think the direction that we're moving is we are moving more toward being interested in the time-varying value of efficiency. Every kilowatt hour is the same in the way we're reporting data. Well, that's not really true in terms of value. And so the direction that we're moving is that, and the other thing I would point is that value is based on time. And I also think that we're also seeing essentially system-wide programs here. And I think the future in some cases will be the value of efficiency can be used to offset investments in distribution systems and or in procurements. And so we're not really counting programs that are being used as part of distributed energy resource procurements where efficiency can participate. We're generally not seeing the data for those things yet. And over time, we may see more of that. So I think there's going to be more integration of efficiency with other kinds of demand-side strategies.
All right, Chuck, here's another question for you. What actions can public utility commissions and utilities and other program administrators proactively take to address the issue we highlight in our report with respect to standards, taking a big chunk out of voluntary energy efficiency programs going forward?
Well, I think it's important for program administrators to explicitly account for the impact of standards over the next decade. You can see that, starting to see that in terms of integrated resource plans that utilities are filing and how they're trying to account for load forecasts. I mean, one of the things we should recognize is that we're seeing some real successes for efficiency. I mean, we are seeing flat load growth and in many places in the country, and we're, that's a byproduct of changes in the economy, efficiency policies that are both standards and codes as well as these programs. They're having an impact. And we also need to be cognizant that standards and changes in markets like LEDs, they're going to affect the mix and possibly the cost performance of program portfolios going forward. So we should expect the mix of programs to change over time. It's going to have to. And program administrators are probably going to have to increase their emphasis on market sectors that are less subject to standards, which suggests more of an emphasis on whole building system retrofits, innovative controls, measures that may produce time-varying energy savings, controllable loads in terms of demand response, savings that are coincident with utility or ISO system peaks, industrial process type retrofits, industrial sector programs like strategic energy management or energy management information systems or retrocommissioning, things that are less amenable to standards. And so those are the kind of things we have to think about. And then finally, I think what it means is if a larger share of the technical potential will reside among industrial customers, then PUCs and administrators are going to have to think about these kind of opt-out programs and self-direct programs. And at a minimum, try to do a good job of accounting for their impacts, because they are, the claims of folks in these areas is that these programs are, industrial customers don't need to be in these programs because they can do it themselves. Well, they do account for a large part of the potential, the remaining potential, and we should make sure that it's really happening.
Ian, here's a question about measure lives. And, there's really a comment here on, are there ways to standardize reporting to address the examples we raised with inconsistently assigned measure lives, and in fact, in many cases, no assigned measure lives? So what are some of the ways that we might try to address that issue in, for example, working with DOE's Uniform Methods Project? And Chuck, of course, feel free to weigh in here too.
Yeah, I would say, there's a significant effort to develop technical resource manuals in various regions of the country. We actually have, I think, a fair amount of geographic coverage for those manuals, but the values in them do differ, and sometimes there are good reasons for them to differ. I mean, an outdoor light bulb is going to not last quite as long in a less temperate location than it does in a temperate one. But we do see variability beyond what one might expect from seeing that kind of variability in application. So I do think there's a lot of value. We do have discussions with Mike Lee about the UMP and have some participation there. But it is worthwhile to, I think, for program administrators to spend a little bit of time examining what those values ought to be in their jurisdictions, and try and look at similar jurisdictions, not just going to say California or other states that have these publicly available databases, and we see a fair amount of that.
So there's a question here about what examples have we seen in our current research about declining costs for efficiency programs? Ian, you want to take that one? Besides lighting, of course.
Well,
sure. Go ahead, Chuck.
Well, program costs are really a function of rebates levels that you do, as well as administrative costs. And what we can observe in our sample is that there are some economies of scale for utilities with larger programs in terms of what happens to the cost of saved energy. And you can definitely see, as when people go through the process of ramping up programs from pilots to full scale, there's definitely a decline in how they spread the administrative costs over the program as they ramp up. And then the other dimension is what's happening on the rebate side and the technology side. And Ian may want to comment more about that.
Well, I guess I want to observe that there's a bit of a difference here between the cost of the measures and the cost of the programs. I think Chuck touched on it, but let's take LEDs as an example. We are seeing, as the technology is improving performance, the costs are coming down as shipments increase. Manufacturers, distributors are learning, and those costs are coming down. And as consumers are able to buy LEDs for lower and lower cost, there's really less, in a net sense, for program administrators to incent. And so even though the cost of that technology is coming down, the cost to the program administrator per kilowatt hour is actually going up a bit. Chuck already addressed the question for program up at a program administrator level. One of the key questions is when. When in the kind of the evolution of the program administrator you're talking about.
I think we have time for one more question here. When you raise this up and look at the costs over time, how do the costs for the current period through 2015 compare to our earlier reports?
So in general, we don't see a large increase in the program administrator cost of saved energy in this study versus the values that we reported in the previous study. We do see that the program administrator cost of saved energy is going up. The total cost of saved energy also is going up. Even accounting for inflation, but especially the latter is not going up very much. It's pretty flat. The rate of increase is pretty modest, and so really most of the increase that we see is on the program administrator side. We actually see pretty flat costs when it comes to participant cost of saved energy. I guess Chuck touched on this a bit with that slide that showed program administrators kind of divvied up by their level of savings. Even though we see as a group, across all program administrators, we do see an increase in costs. it's very different when you look at the individual members of that group and kind of the magnitude of savings, kind of where they are in developing the markets and so on. So for some, it's actually going down.
All right. Well, thank you, Chuck Goldman and Ian Hoffman. And I also want to thank again our other co-authors, Sean Murphy, Natalie Mims-Frick, and Greg Levenis, and our funders at the U.S. Department of Energy and EPA. Thanks very much for your attention. I hope you'll take a look at our report for more information and look forward to sharing with you results in the next year on our updates on the cost of saving natural gas, on the cost of saving electricity with public power utilities, and also taking a look at the cost of saving electricity on peak. Thanks again. Have a good day. Goodbye.